welcome everybody this afternoon. We're here to talk about education in the Middle East. And just to let you know that the session this afternoon is going to be recorded, and we'll factor in some time for questions at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A function. And we'll have a look at those. But if you can put your name, and then if we don't get time at the end to respond to your question, then we'll respond after the session to you by email. And also, you'll receive a follow-up email from us after the session, which will include sign-up details for the next sessions that we're running. So my name's Sian Jackson. I'm a Principal Associate with Mills & Reeve, and I work in the Employment Education team at Mills & Reeve. I do a lot of international work advising on education institutions, on staff working overseas, the staff aspects of international partnerships, and setting up branches overseas. I'm joined this afternoon by Dima Al-Wazani, who's an associate in our education team. And Dima is dual qualified in the UK and the Middle East, having worked in the Middle East prior to joining Mills & Reeve. And I'm delighted to be joined by Ivor McGettigan, who's from our best friend firm in the Middle East called Al Tamimi. And we've had the benefit of a long relationship with Al Tamimi over the years, working on a number of matters. We've had people that have gone on secondment from the firm to Al Tamimi. We attend each other's conferences. So thank you for joining this morning, Ivor. I think it would be helpful if, to start, if we could probably, you could detail any key developments or opportunities that you see in the Middle East that might be worth highlighting for universities that are currently in the UK.
Thank you, Sian. It's a great pleasure to be with you and the audience here today. A very warm welcome from Dubai as the sun goes down this evening. From a UAE perspective, it's one of the biggest private education markets in the world. But with that, it's become over the years the most sophisticated jurisdiction for higher education, which also means to some extent it has reached saturation point. We have about 111 higher education institutions in the UAE, which is a large number given the population. But there are some idiosyncrasies that drive the demand here, including the location. You know, we're within a 3-hour plane ride off, I think, 40% of the world's population. So we have a lot of education tourism here and people coming and pursuing their degrees here from outside the actual country and outside the immediate Gulf region as well. There are certain opportunities, I believe, for higher education institutions in the UAE, notwithstanding what I just said. There are certain offerings that would be in very high demand here, and which the government and the Ministry of Education have earmarked as things of huge interest to them. One would be in respect of teacher training, another would be in respect of nursing, and then the third piece would be vocational. I know that's a huge topic on its own, but that's an area of interest. The other thing that I wanted to mention was we have in the UAE quite a lot of huge industrial conglomerates that have probably no one on the call probably has heard before. But for example, the largest merger in the world last 2 years ago was here in the UAE, $110 billion merger between two companies. And these companies are government-owned companies that are involved in advancing the national agenda. So things like, for example, aviation, defense, as varied as that, from that to hotels and leisure, sports, entertainment, etc. These are vast companies, and some of them, for example, run airports, nuclear reactors, ports, terminals, you know, the whole 9 yards. And what we're seeing is an appetite in those type of entities for micro-credentials or training as regards governance and other topics, perhaps not necessarily leading to certifications, but just that type of training that would add value to their executives. And these are truly behemoth organizations who are interested in talking to higher education providers.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting in relation to kind of saturation point, but perhaps there's opportunities there in terms of vocational and perhaps with industry partnerships. Would you say the same in terms of the saturation for, as well as Dubai, is the same for Egypt and Saudi Arabia, or is it wider opportunities, would you say, for those regions?
Yeah, they're very different markets in a number of senses. Number one, Egypt, 92 million people, if not more, huge population. Culturally, they place a lot of emphasis on education, and you know, there is a neighborhood in Cairo where the average house price is $750,000, and 1 million people live in that neighborhood. So, you know, that's bigger than Dublin. So we have, as Napoleon said, you know, quantity has a quality all of its own. So Egypt does have some incredible demographic figures that we need to look at and can't be ignored. Secondly, the LCC government has said that there can be no new universities locally unless they sign an agreement, an academic collaboration agreement with a leading international university. And this was announced 4 or 5 years ago. The first Western government to ink a deal with Egypt was actually the UK. And so the UK government signed an MOU with Cairo to say that, you know, we can provide the international leading university part of the equation. And we've helped a number of UK universities enter Egypt. The other thing to mention about Egypt is they're building a whole new capital city, almost like Brasilia in Brazil. They're doing the same near Cairo. And as part of that, they need a whole new infrastructure, including educational infrastructure. And you know, the idea, I know we're talking about, people talk about ed tech and remote learning, etc. In Egypt, in this region, there's still a preference for, you know, physical bricks and mortar, people attending university. So I think massive opportunities in Egypt. Some challenges. I mean, just recently in the headlines, people may have seen the devaluation of the Egyptian pound. You know, so there are some challenges. I'm not going to say it's all plain sailing, but definitely worth a second look. In relation to Saudi Arabia, it's within the Gulf region, Egypt being part of MENA, Middle East, North Africa, Saudi being the Gulf. 80% of the GCC student population live in Saudi Arabia. So it's, you know, outsized dominance in the GCC Gulf region in that sense. It was a closed shop until a number of years ago. Then they announced the opening up of education, along with many other sectors, to foreign direct investment and the quest for bringing in leading international education providers into the kingdom. I would say that I haven't exactly seen a deluge of people moving in there yet. I think we would see that more in Egypt. It's interesting because Egypt and Saudi were both embarking on these journeys around the same time, but Egypt's traveled much further in our experience and looking at the deals that are happening. But Saudi is awakening. I think there's going to be huge opportunities. I go there regularly, and from talking to the regulators there and the stakeholders, they have a bias for US and UK. I mean, that's the reality. A lot of Saudi students have gone number one to the US on scholarships, and then number two the UK, and those two by far are the top sort of learning centers that they would look to. So I think there's going to be opportunities. Also in Saudi, they lead the region as regards research and development. So if we look at the number of patents being issued and IP being created, actually created rather than really created in this region, Saudi is by far number one, and not just because it's the biggest population. They have invested heavily in that area, particularly in relation to oil and gas and energy, of course. So again, I think there's going to be opportunities for UK higher education providers in the right sectors to enter that enter that country, which is called the kingdom. And also they're going to go down a route of, Abu Dhabi have created a nuclear energy solution. They're going to do the same. So that opens up a whole chapter of STEM and engineering and high-end courses and certification in that regard. So and that's just one area of the economy. The whole economy is opening. So I think there will be a lot of opportunities there as well.
Ivor, from my experience and from what you just said as well, we're seeing a rapid growth in the Middle East and in higher education in the Middle East. I mean, there's presence of for a lot of universities, whether from the UK, US, Germany, different countries. And a lot of students who are international students in the UK are now choosing to stay in the Middle East. And a big example is RCSI in Bahrain now. There's also a lot of international companies, and as you just mentioned, and a lot of multinational innovative technology, and a lot of big opportunities that are currently happening in the Middle East. And we see a lot of collaborations between the private sector and students and universities, work placements, etc. And at the same time, I also know that there are some challenges to international universities, such as the heavily regulated region and sector. So my question is, what would the key drivers and key risks for the UK universities be to collaborate with partners in the Middle East?
Yeah, thanks, Dima. And look, you touched on a really salient point. The pandemic was probably one of the best things that could have happened to higher education in the UAE, frankly. Prior to the pandemic, because of that number of institutions that we had, there was competition for student recruitment. When the pandemic occurred, the higher education institutions were all full to the rafters here, and because people weren't traveling abroad. But also generally, there's a cultural dimension to it where perhaps Gulf parents would, prefer their children to go to local institutions. So that's not an absolute, but just there's some degree of that certainly in the conversation. As you said, Dima, it's a heavily regulated part of the world. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So, I had to do an exercise for a client, do a comparative analysis of UK, US, and the Middle East as regards regulation. And, the UK is in the middle, US is very much laissez-faire on the regulatory side, whereas the UAE is quite a top-down approach, and the other countries as well, in the sense that the Ministry of Education are hands-on. They do ask for a lot of information. Information is not particularly sensitive information, but the institutions, for example, would be sending them quarterly information of who's registered, doing what courses, their Emirates ID, their ID number, and who's doing what courses, and the lecturers, where are they from, what are they doing. It's a sort of information gathering exercise, and there is a concern in the UAE over the last few years that the quality of the institutions hasn't been what they would like it to be. So part of this top-down approach is also in relation to quality, and they've brought in external consultants to help them assess universities to ensure that they are delivering quality products. And it's not just a sort of a branch campus in a free zone in Dubai with a whiteboard and a few desks. They want it to be more substantive type of relationship than that. So certainly from a regulatory point of view, that is something to be aware of. On the flip side, I would say that it's very easy to meet regulators here, and I mean meeting the top cheese. I mean, if somebody wanted to meet the head of the regulator next week, that could be arranged without any problem, and there would be a red carpet out and a warm welcome. And they are innovative in the sense that, if you said you're interested in doing some new course or some new angle on something that would interest them, and you would meet them, and you would have a honest and frank conversation with the regulator. So there's no distance in that sense. And I know the regulators have WhatsApp groups where they communicate freely with the universities, the registrars of the universities. So this is something that may not be in the UK and is here, and is a positive, I would say. As regards entering the market here, if you're going to do it with a local partner, so typically, for example, UK educational institution might approach a local partner, or a local partner might approach them and say, we're interested in bringing your brand to this region. Just a few things to be, I would say, aware of. Some of this is from bitter experience, what I'm about to share, but what you might face here is, people saying, this is a fantastic idea, we're really behind this, but we need to do our due diligence on our local partners. And that means a lot of these local partners are huge conglomerates, family groups that are involved in a number of different things, but are they involved in education? And what's their track record in education? If they're not involved in that sector, we need to be a little bit more circumspect in order to manage their expectations about what, it's not going to be a quick buck out of this. It's going to be a long-term relationship, and we have certain values that we want you to respect, us as the education provider. So we have to do very detailed due diligence, I would say, on the partner and their track record. And there are certain ways that, you can do that locally. We don't have public information like Companies House in the UK, but there are other ways that we can do it. Then from a negotiation perspective, if we say, for example, we're not going to invest a penny into this, we're a registered charity, for example, in the UK, we can't invest anything in this project. We're just bringing the main event, we're bringing our IP or brand or curriculum, but we need you to fund it, which would be a normal arrangement. In some cases, that will be the person you're talking to will agree and say, yes, I understand, but then turn around later on 3 or 4 months down the line and say, actually, I need you to put in 10% or 20%, whatever. And this is an issue where they perhaps think that we're having this line about not contributing anything as a negotiating tactic. So we need to be very clear at the outset that it's not a negotiating tactic. It's just something we're actually bound by our statutes normally, that we can't actually do this. So that's a sort of a idiosyncrasy that we have to deal with. The other thing is, a lot of time we're dealing with somebody who is not the actual main decision maker in the entity that we're talking to, and he or she will conduct conversations with us up to a particular point, and only then will the main decision maker come in. This is quite common here. That can have pitfalls as well, and they're pretty obvious. One is that the decision maker hasn't really been fully briefed or hasn't really thought about this in the level of detail that the person that's talking to us has led us to believe. And again, we're talking about managing expectations. So I think it's important that we set out our stall early in a forceful but polite way, and deal with our partners, in that sense. The other thing I would say is, the streets aren't paved with gold. Not everyone's a millionaire in the Middle East, and I know that's a trope, but it does require patience. And if somebody's going to set up an institution here or get involved in academic collaboration agreement, there's no substitute for coming here, meeting the regulators, pressing the flesh. People really believe in relationships in this region, and that can't be replicated through Zoom or Microsoft Teams. You have to come here if you're serious about it, and people will open the door and meet you. There'll be no problem setting up loads of meetings with influential people. But then, as I said, building that relationship does require a medium-term outlook rather than a short-term one. I hope that goes some way towards answering your question, but yeah, please.
We've had a couple of questions in that has just linked to what you just said a little bit, really, in terms of, and one of them is about using agents, because obviously a lot of it is about the different authorities in the different regions in the Middle East, and what your thoughts are about using agents to manage the relationships, and whether that would differ depending on where in the Middle East you were thinking about. One of the questions.
Very good question. I think at the initial stage it's fine, but and I mean the very initial stage, but if you're going to invest time, forget about money, but if you're going to invest time and frontal cortex into this, thinking about this, it's better just to go to the regulator. So if I was in the UK institution's shoes, and I was interested in the region generally, I would probably arrange 2 or 3 days in the region, UAE, Saudi, Egypt, perhaps, meet the tee up in advance. Your agent can tee up the meetings with the regulators. The regulators in the UAE specifically want to see the whites of the eyes of the people that they're talking to, and sit down with them and really discuss it. But I think agents have a role. But ultimately, I wouldn't spend, for example, 6 months going through an agency and then saying, okay, let's go out and see what it's all about. I would maybe start off with an agent, particularly as regards, the agent can be very helpful as regards finding the local partner, that fit that you might need. And that's fantastic, because that is, that's work that's quite time consuming and can't be done from the UK. So that's perfect for the agent. But as regards the regulator and working out what type of courses they want to see you offer and the opportunities, I would jump on the plane and get out here.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. Back to the bitter experience of having 6 months negotiating with a partner. You don't want an extra layer of and risk of it being through an agent, particularly if you find out it's not the person who's the decision maker, which we've both seen. Dima, I think you had a related question.
Yeah, you mentioned relationships, and I know that relationships and networking is important everywhere, but as you just said, it's very essential and key in the Middle East, especially. So how best might UK universities foster relations with partners in the Middle East?
Yeah, number of options here. The UK Department of International Trade is very active in the region, and the huge delegations static here in the UAE and in Saudi, very large delegations. That's an obvious one, and they have subject matter expertise on education and higher education specifically. So it's not like talking to somebody who doesn't know. I mean, they know exactly the state of the market, and the UK embassy the British embassy in the UAE, Saudi, Egypt, and any other country as well would be well sourced and have their finger close to the pulse. I would also say, meeting the regulators, as I said before, very easy to meet them, and it's an open door policy here all the time for them. And an hour with them is worth its weight in gold from the intel that you'll get out of it and what they want out of it. I mean, they won't play the cards close to their chest. They'll be very candid. If they don't think what you're offering is a good idea or there's no place for it in the market, they'll tell you, which is great. I mean, it means we don't have to waste time. So that's helpful. I would say the other element will be, there's a lot of universities here. I mean, I mentioned in Egypt, any new university needs to do a joint venture with a top global 500. But even there's existing universities in all the jurisdictions here. Quite a few of them owned by state-owned universities, federal or locally funded universities, who are going through various transformation programs and modernizing. And I've seen a lot of those talking to international universities and saying, look, we've got this faculty running XYZ. Can you come in and help us with this particular school? Maybe even just be one particular school out of the whole overall offering. So that's becoming more common, and I think there's opportunities there in relation to that. Then the other piece would be some of these massive industrial conglomerates. I mean, we have Aramco, it's the most highly capitalized company in the world in Saudi Arabia. We have ones at a smaller scale, Mubadala, ADQ here in the UAE, who the breadth of what they're doing is a huge sweep, and there's certainly opportunities there, because the other part of the agenda is, they have these national champions, you could call these companies, who have a high percentage of local citizens working in them, and the goal, isn't just to make a profit, but it's also to help their own people develop, learn new skills, on-the-job training, lifelong learning, all these beautiful things that can be done, and they're open to opportunities to talk to international providers to come in and do that. Just yesterday, I had lunch with a US university who are coming in to do something like that in Saudi Arabia. So, just to prove the point, these opportunities are happening on a day-by-day basis in these countries. And I suppose the final one, Dima, on that one, just to mention, Mills and Reeve and Al Tamimi, we work hand in glove together. They've got phenomenal connections in the UK. Needs no, they don't need any introduction. We've got great connections here, and I can safely say neither of us are sort of billing Nazis. We're quite conducive to people contacting us and asking us to explore maybe some opportunities. And I'm speaking on behalf of Sean here, and hoping she'll agree. Hoping she'll agree with me.
Yeah.
But we know we generally quite
it's
relaxed about this type of thing.
Yeah, I think we've worked as two firms for long enough to kind of share the knowledge to the benefit of clients, so that we can kind of hit the ground running, and particularly with Middle East, where the relationships are so important. and you having that on the ground knowledge of opportunities, and also just the nitty gritty, whether it's the particular regulator in the particular region in the Middle East, or relationships or particular difficulties, then we've done it, and we've managed projects together, haven't we, over many years, really smoothly and successfully for clients. So I think it works really well to have that the benefit of working so closely together, given the global strategy for a lot of the universities and looking to the Middle East. Just see if we've got time for just a quick one of the questions. We've got a few, so if I just pick one. One is about the comparison of the educational framework. So probably we can assume that's the kind of regulatory framework between the different regions. Particularly, this one's asking about Bahrain compared to UAE. And you touched on that. I suppose UAE can be perhaps more restrictive given that it's so saturated. But quickly, if you've got any points about the comparison between the two.
Yeah, great question. Generally, all 6 Gulf countries, which is Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi, are very, very similar in a lot of respects. For example, their employment law is almost identical in all 6. And likewise, the regulatory framework is fundamentally coming from the same place. So there will be differences in process, but fundamentally the principles are the same. And in fact, Bahrain's interesting because Bahrain was UAE 20 years ago. I mean, with no disrespect to Bahrain, but Bahrain was the leading jurisdiction for international investment, FDI, education. St. Christopher's School, the most famous school in the Middle East, Bahrain. Dima mentioned the Royal College of Surgeons that are there. They also have some very fine institutions themselves. So that's interesting. And in fact, in some ways, UAE has sort of copied their homework and have a similar sort of approach to things. So huge similarities. There will be differences in process, but fundamentally it's going to be very similar.
Thank you. Well, just to finish up, thank you everybody for joining. We've got, you'll receive information about our last 2 sessions in the series. The next one is on the 15th of November, and we're looking at Germany and the Netherlands. That's Graf with our best friend firms, Graf von Westphalen and also Van Betham and Kulen. And then we've got Southeast Asia on the 6th of December. So hopefully you'll be able to join for those. And also if you can take just a couple of minutes to fill in the feedback form at the end of the session, that would be great. So thank you to Ivor for joining us, and everybody who's attended. Thank you.